Hello, welcome to Harlem Stories. This is Adam Feinberg, and I'm here with my co-host again today, Dominic.
Hey, how's it going? How's it going, everybody?
All right, awesome. So we today have an interesting topic. It's not one that I think I've heard on any of the other podcasts, but I think it's something that's really important, especially because Upper Manhattan, a lot of these buildings over here, they are either self-managed or a lot of times they're smaller buildings. So today we wanted to talk about that. I've been elected to my condo or co-op board. And what do we do from there?
Yeah, let's get right into it. So, as you were saying, you've been elected to the condo board. So, now what?
So, today, if you haven't noticed, we're going to do this a little differently styled, and Dom is going to wind up interviewing me. So, yeah, a lot of these buildings over here, because they are small to mid-size, there's a lot that are actually self-managed. Mm-hmm. And I gotta say, I've done it, and I wish I didn't have to. And for any buildings that are actually trying to do it on their own, meaning that they're not hiring a managing agent, this is definitely something that's really, really difficult, because even when you have a managing agent, the laws seem to change, and they don't necessarily inform anyone very easily and readily. So you have to have somebody that is really on top of it. Otherwise, expect to get tickets and penalties and violations, and it's no fun. A lot of people, they're doing double duty, handling the work that a managing agent will do. Larger buildings, they have less of an issue recruiting board member because the work can be divided into subcommittees. And it's sometimes you'll have a board review committee or a garden committee and all these different groups. So most of this conversation is going to be geared to small to mid-sized buildings that don't have an on-site manager.
Do you think, I know you were talking about a lot of rules changing and things like that. Do you need any special skills to join the board, or can anybody join the board?
Anybody can join the board. And, first off, I want to say that most of these roles, it's very rare that I've actually seen it. I actually do know one building where, it's the opposite of the norm. And the norm is that these jobs are unpaid. Mm. They are volunteer. Mm-hmm. You do not need any special skills. But if you do have your own, employment-based skill sets and whatnot, can certainly be applied. So if you have, examples of finance, accounting, law, if you know building codes, construction, even if you're just a project manager in your day-to-day job, that could be really incredibly useful. So board can be certainly be effective without board members, without this type of previous experience, though you'll more often than not going to be more reliant on outside experts to help guide the building. Every building, I'd say, has a unique personality defined by the board and how they manage the building. But I think to better understand the role of the board, my own experience can give you some color to help give some perspective. Mm-hmm.
So I know that, you're a real estate expert, and you're a real estate expert in the area. And so how did that really help you when you kind of jumped on into the board?
So I didn't start off as a real estate expert and whatnot. I was kind of thrown to the wolves, so to speak. And, so I think it's kind of helpful to give you a little background, to give some sort of flavor. And as of last week, I've been in my apartment for 20 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So, but in 2006, when I went up first buying, and closing on my apartment, I was actually a first-time home buyer. I had some knowledge and experience that didn't necessarily always apply because I grew up watching This Old House. And if you've ever seen that movie, The Money Pit, the house I grew up was kind of like that. It was on this beautiful plot of land, and it was we probably would have been easier off had we demoed the house and started from scratch, because every week something would break. So, that was kind of my knowledge and experience base. But obviously, when you start applying that to New York City condos, that doesn't really apply so much. or co-ops, and because from managing the building perspective, condos and co-ops are going to be pretty much almost identical in most aspects. Yeah. So the biggest differential is the board approval and buyer and seller situations. But yeah, and of course, there's going to be some things like financing and whatnot that might have more to do on a co-op. But on most of the day-to-day maintenance items, it's really going to be that. So it's just helpful for me to give a little background. In 2006, I bought a brand new construction condo. It had just 12 apartments in it. It sold out really quickly, which was both a positive and a negative, because what wound up happening is when a building sells out quickly, especially in a small building, developer has little to no responsibility left over at that point. So if there's any problems, the developer, based on their reputation, if they don't care about their reputation, they can basically tell you, goodbye, we don't care about you. And some expletives that we're going to leave out of this episode. But yeah, that's pretty much what we were given was those curse words when we found out discovering there were problems. But it was built with so many problems. We kind of feel like, and I don't want to talk out of turn, but I've had too many bad experiences for it to be coincidence. But it sure seems like somebody at the DOB was paid off.
What was some of these key factors that kind of made this building feel like it wasn't constructed properly?
So people were moving in and the elevator broke down. This is like brand new building. That's number one. The owner of the penthouse moves in and the entire penthouse level of the building was flooded. Oh my. It turns out after going through engineers and architects and contractors, the entire penthouse walls of the building needed to be redone. We had to take them all down, and they had to be rebuilt from scratch. So it kind of gives you a better sense of of all these different issues, right off the bat. So what wound up happening was ultimately everyone is screaming at each other, during these board meetings, and you can bet that everybody's actually in attendance because they're all angry about something.
Exactly.
So this is I didn't really want to be on the board, and I always figured okay, I'm buying into a small building. I've got a finance background. It's almost inevitable somebody's going to ask me to join the board.
Yep, they're going to ask you.
And I kind of knew that, and I was trying to avoid it, but when I saw the problems were just so massive, I basically said, I can't dodge this. Yeah. I'm just I don't really want to serve on the board. So this actually goes back to another question on the sales side of the business. I'm just should you be buying into a small building if you don't want to serve on the board? So this is a conversation I have with many of my buyers, especially when they see that amazing apartment. And I'm just there's risk levels here that you might not be comfortable with. Let me talk to you about it, and we walk it through, and I said, is this something that you're comfortable with? And more often than not, the answer is no. So at least at that point, and then of course they'll keep sending me listings in small buildings.
Of course.
But that's not even the point over there. So I found myself, in essence, we were supposed to have the managing agent as the developer, and they weren't doing anything, and then they just wanted to get paid. So basically, I said, no, you're not getting paid. You didn't do anything. I'm I see all these past due bills, and Con Ed is threatening to shut off power to the building, and and we're having all these problems and whatnot. And it's clear because the managing agent / developer, they weren't doing any of it. So basically, when I wound up finding out, and because I've got that accounting, finance, economics type of background, it wasn't terribly difficult for me to put everything together. It took time, but I'm here I am in an unpaid role, and the developer wants to get paid. And I'm no
way,
absolutely not. So people were appreciating already that I was stepping up and saying no to expenses that were not legitimate as far as we were concerned. And I said, you want to know something? Take us to court.
Yeah.
You know, if you don't like it, take us to court because, quite honestly, I'm like, you've breached your responsibilities.
So I know that you have mentioned that you had fights with the developer, and I know that you mentioned that there were a couple of infighting with the tenants. So
Right.
how did you manage to get this fighting to stop? Like, how did that happen?
So that was interesting,
Yeah.
and that was an entire lengthy process.
Yes.
Now, within that lengthy process, you know, basically said to everyone, I started taking polls with working with them. Now, I worked on Wall Street. I've managed lots of projects before, you know, so for me, there was really nothing new in like, you know, just managing a project. You know, so I broke it down into multiple components and I said, I'm like, first off, we have to have a better understanding, number one, what our routine monthly expenses are. Number two, we need to understand what's wrong in each one of these apartments. So we need to go apartment by apartment and interview the owners and find out what exactly is going on. So I'm doing this. I'm working a 60-plus hour week on my regular Wall Street job, you know, at this time, and I'm trying to manage this. Everyone's screaming on me. Now, one thing I didn't mention previously that's worth mentioning over here. So not only is it a small building, but I am the first apartment on the ground floor that everyone has to walk
Everyone
past.
walks by you. Yep.
So, I mean, now, granted, it was so bad at one point, like, you know, with all everything that was going on, and we had all the wrong tenants for, you know, the ones that were being used as investment units. I actually had tenants that were banging on my bedroom window at 3 o'clock in the morning just to be let in. So I'm getting zero sleep. I'm like trying to like get it, like everyone under control. But ultimately, here's what I wound up doing. So after I got the poll, I wound up putting together almost a project management plan, and I put together this very fancy looking matrix identifying like what all the problems are going to be. Then, you know, I said, I'm like, listen, we need to hire a managing agent. And, you know, I worked with the managing agent now, that was an argument in and of itself because we knew that was going to add to everyone's expenses, you know, but basically I said, listen, do you want me to walk off or do you want me to actually do this? And you know, so we wound up hiring a managing agent. First one we did for a year, did an awful job. And to this day, I can tell you to warn away from that managing agent, but that's another story altogether. And, you know, what I can say from there is that, you know, I wound up, we wound up hiring a new managing agent. I step off. I've identified some of the problems, you know, that are going on in the building over there. I feel like I said that. I'm like, now that we have a managing agent, you know, that gives me a chance to take a little bit of a breather. Managing agent starts bringing in some contractors and whatnot, starts getting some estimates. Gave me like it was a little over a year to give me a break. To settle in, and I'm like, for me to get a breather because it's just, you know, it was just too much. And over time, you know, what we wound up doing was, you know, finding out exactly what this is all realistically going to, you know, cost us. You know, so what I basically did was I told everyone I wanted to set expectations. And I said, listen, common charges, we just upped already, you know, significantly from like, I think they were something like, I want to say $385 a month for common charges for the typical apartment in my building, and we're 2-bed, 2 baths for the most part. Okay. So $385, like that's like ridiculously
low.
You're not paying. So the people that stepped in after me that took over temporarily. They were, 2 out of the 3 were real estate agents, and a real estate one was a broker, one was an agent. The third one had nothing to do with that, but her husband just happened to be a Nobel laureate in economics, so there was some credibility there. The 2 that were working in real estate, they were under the impression that we needed to keep common charges really low. And, you know, this goes to, like, the big question. And this is something that I think that anybody listening to this episode really needs to make note of. And, their position was that low common charges mean that the value of the home goes up. And I'd say that's true in limited circumstances. Now, the building has got to be in good financial and physical shape in order for that to be true. We were neither. So, for us to have a ridiculously low common charges, didn't make sense. So when I'm reviewing it, I said, listen, we need to put in a little bit for a reserve. It turns out, as time passes, we also have a foreclosure going on. So on top of all that, we're now being pressured with 11 out of 12 common charges being, coming in. Not everyone was even paying it routinely, so they needed an enforcer too. So I needed to be the enforcer. I needed to, be that. Now, managing agent helped, kind of separate me a little, but they needed somebody that was actually going to take charge and say, hey, managing agent, I'm like, I need you to follow up, more strictly with, apartments, this one, and this one. And ultimately that was the case. But I think once we laid out, what the approximate costs were going to be, it was actually what I guesstimated, like a year and a half, 2 years earlier, it was going to be right around that number. And it was something like, I want to say, and keep in mind, this is like 17, 18 years ago back then. So the number was a lot more significant then than it is today. But I said probably looking at a minimum of $25,000 per apartment special assessment and doubling of the common charges.
I know they were not happy when you said that.
No, but at the same time, what I did was I put together an entire, I want to say it was probably something like 10, 15-page report, along with my matrix, identifying what each of the problems were. And then, I categorized each one of those problems within the matrix as high risk, medium risk, or low risk scenarios. So everyone kind of, had a better understanding. Yep. And then what we did is we attached costs to them or approximate, because sometimes when you're working on some of these things, you never know. And at the same time, I'm tackling the delayed payment aspect of all this. Ultimately I said, listen, I think my approach is the right one. And I think the way this is going to play out is that you're going to hate me until you love me.
Exactly.
Because we were having special assessment after special assessment, and some of these special assessments were for all the wrong reasons. Yeah. It was because our common charges were too low, and we couldn't even afford to pay our routine monthly expenses.
Okay, so let me jump in here. So I know you mentioned two things, common charges and special assessment. For the audience out there that doesn't know the difference, do you want to quickly explain common charges and then what a special assessment is?
Yeah, so, common charges are meant to be your routine monthly expenses for the building. So that's going to be everything from the water bill, the electric, elevator maintenance, paying the managing agent, paying the super, all those kind of expenses. Now, ideally, you'd also want to have a reserve, included in there. Now, most of the banks, they want to see at least 10% of your total expenses. We weren't fully there, so I didn't price that all in at once. And I said, you know what? We don't have a reserve now. The building's a whole mess. So I'm not even worried about, banks financing in the building right now, because it's like right now it's such a mess. Let's not even worry about that. So let's gradually, and over a 3-year horizon, what we wanted doing was increasing those common charges, so it wasn't all at once. But it was kind of like we needed some, cash infusion. That just meant, having a special assessment that was for regular expenses, which you generally shouldn't be doing. But to explain those special assessments, those are usually items that are meant for long-term planning, more capital improvements, things like, fixing roofs, boilers and elevators, but also things like upgrading the lobby, so, those are kind of things that are usually used for special assessments. And, we were doing special assessments for both that reason and because we weren't covering our full monthlies.
Gotcha.
So we didn't make all the upgrades all at once, but ultimately, since the elevators were breaking down so frequently, what we'd wound up doing was, I brought in a subject matter expert that knew elevators. And they basically said, I'm like, and this was a learning process for me, and I guarantee you most agents have no clue about this kind of stuff. Yeah. And there's no reason why they should have to until you actually encounter issues. But I found out that all these elevator systems, they are run very, very differently. And not every elevator service company can service every elevator system correctly. So this subject matter expert not only identified what the problems in our elevator system were, but they also identified 3 different service companies that could service us going forward once those repairs were made. So that was really an important aspect over there. So not only did we, over that 3-year period, we had those huge special assessments, but we were actually making sure that we were enforcing it. And, in some cases, it got so bad that we had to threaten potentially either putting in liens or even moving toward foreclosure proceedings on multiple units. And, and here's the thing, because you're in a smaller building, like this is a 12-unit building, your neighbors, it's like they're not like strangers. Yeah, in these smaller buildings, you actually see your neighbors. And even if you try and avoid them, it's like the reality is you are going to bump into them. So I felt like, I needed rule from kindness and do that. So we had like one owner in particular. She was an investor, and what she did was, put her unit. She didn't want to sell it because it was a great investment, but she just opened up an art gallery in London, which was her lifelong dream. Yet she's losing sleep over an investment property that is, even though the prices were going up at that point, like the costs were also going up, and like she's losing sleep and she's crying and having trouble sleeping. And I said to her, quite frankly, I'm like, just being honest here, I'm like, but like your dream is to run a gallery. Yeah. Your dream was not to have an investment property that's not performing. Yeah. I'm like, why don't you get your sleep back, sell the apartment, you'll be able to repay the condo association, because she was seriously delinquent on it. And, the last thing anyone wants to do, especially when it's your neighbors, is foreclose on your neighbors. Mm-hmm. So, ultimately she took my advice on that. And this is long before I became an agent. So she wound up listing, and she actually wound up walking away with a profit. Yeah. So it was actually for the best, but it didn't always work out that nicely. Unfortunately, there was one neighbor, and it took a ridiculously long amount of time, and I had to foreclose on one of my neighbors. Almost 13 years from the time that she defaulted until we got new neighbors in. So it's not exactly easy, but hey, at the same time, one of the things that helped the most was that I was giving owners a roadmap. Mm-hmm. We had open communications, and as much as it pained everyone to come up with the additional money, and the fact that we were doubling common charges and all this pain, it didn't happen overnight, but people were actually seeing the results. Mm-hmm. And eventually, and I said, my goal was to eventually stabilize the building so that, like, you could have predictable monthlies on a month-to-month basis. And special assessments, they shouldn't be a routine thing. They shouldn't be happening 3 times a year, 4 times a year. And that was what was happening. So by creating that roadmap over there, now I had special skills that most, the average person wouldn't have that actually applied here. So I had a combination between project management skills and finance and and a little bit on the real estate stuff, and I was learning that really quickly because it was something that interested me so much. But it was like one of these things that was just so complicated, to map out. So I quite honestly, I can see there's some buildings on the market over here now. Yeah. I'm looking at them like they're new construction, and I'm like, oh my God, the developer actually lives down the road, and they listed their home address as their work address. They're down the road from where I grew up. Yeah. And I'm like, and this is like a 12-unit building or something like that. And I'm like, I see it already. I see the risks. I'm like, good luck. 3 different buyers asked me about this development, and I'm like, listen, I haven't actually even gotten into the building, but I can tell you this is a high-risk scenario. Mm-hmm. If you're comfortable with that, let's go see it. Let's do it. But if you're not, certainly that is the case. So going back to your original interview question, I'm like, do you need special skills? Mm-hmm. The answer is typically going to be no, especially if you have a managing agent. If you don't, you might actually need some specialist skills because you're basically taking on the job, but you don't have to pay anybody a monthly fee. And I can tell you, like for 12-unit building, you're probably going to pay over $1,000 a month for the managing agent.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's probably even more than that now. So the reality is, I'm like, these are things that boards and buildings need to decide. I'm like, do we have the right members to manage the building ourselves? Do we want to manage the building ourselves? And these are some of the things that, we come up. So, I think this is like a good point over here.
Yeah. So, I mean, so you did all that. You gave them the roadmap, and then you kind of took a step back, and you allowed them to kind of follow your roadmap. So that naturally leads us to this next question. So for new members that are joining the board, how do you direct them into action and when they've never served on a board before?
So I was pretty burnt at that point.
Of course.
So I'm doing like 60 hours a week on my paid job, about 40 hours a week on my unpaid job.
You needed a break.
Yeah, so I needed a break. So I'm like, I wasn't exactly the best teacher, even though my job was learning and professional development. But I was just so fried, and then then I had personal things going on too. So I'm like, I was just fried. So I'm like, I couldn't provide the guidance that I'm providing in this episode. So so I think this is really a good roadmap, for other board members to listen to. And I'm advising a couple of boards right now on a variety of topics. So this really comes down to like, listen, I'm not going to have all the answers. I actually know a good person to direct, to that does this kind of thing, that does advise board members, that's separate from the managing agent, and she'll help, basically she doesn't charge a direct fee. She finds savings for the building, and she takes a percentage of that savings. And, it's almost like that tax certiorari type of role too, where they do the same kind of thing. If they can find your building tax savings, then, they take a portion of that. But going back to your question more directly over here, so it's important to understand that like the board sets the tone, they set the budget, they define policy and procedure and new initiatives. The managing agent, if there's one in play, they're the ones to actually implement all that. Okay. Now, what happens a lot of times in these small buildings is, people forget boundaries. And, you're going to burn out your board members if you're always knocking on their door. And, I'm sure some of these people enjoy interacting with their neighbors, but it's not like the board member's role to solve every problem. That's what you hire a managing agent for. But like that's their role, is they're doing the high level stuff. You hire the managing agent to do the day-to-day routine execution of those plans. So that's like an important distinction, for somebody that just joins a board. What do I need to know? And you're asking the managing agent, say, hey, where are we, with all these things? You're looking to them for guidance and saying, hey, does the budget need reviewing? Do we have upcoming local laws that we need to comply with? Where are we in our status and whatnot? And that's another thing. There's always some new regulation that's coming up. Some of it could be so small, but then you wind up getting fined like $300 or something like that because the Department of Building Inspector just, buzzed their way in on a surprise inspection. And like, I heard something about that, but I didn't know it was actually enacted into law. And next thing you know, you have a violation. So, that's another thing to, to understand, like whether you're going to be on a board or whether you're looking to buy something, it's important to understand that some of these violations, they're kind of like the inspector had to kind of find something. Correct. So, just understand the building could be very well run, but having open violations doesn't necessarily mean that they are poorly run. Now, obviously, we want to take care of it, when it's there, but sometimes it just doesn't make sense. I can tell you, my building, what we didn't know is, from the very beginning, is there's an annual boiler inspection, and you're it's an automated thing over there. So if you don't have it in the Department of Buildings, that the certification that it was done, you automatically receive a violation on January 2nd when they open back up, and I think it's even automated. So, like you're like we still have open violations for that from years past. That we just never wound up clearing. It's like, even though, yes, we've been doing the testing every year since learning this, but at the same time, we still have open violations from like 6-7 years ago.
Gotcha.
Now, does that mean that like we're poorly run? No, it just means that we're not paying a violation, when the city is not mandating it. So like, better to keep it in our pockets longer. So that could be, one certain thing over here. But yeah, it's important to understand that the board is the one that, comes up with the strategy. They're the ones, setting the tone over there, and it's the managing agent. Now, if it's self-managed, they're the ones actually doing it all. So, that's important. Policy and procedure. So, these are things that come up, from routine, as we see as agents, when we see like some crazy, things that have been implemented, we wind up asking them like over here, how much of this is because somebody did something crazy and we've had to implement, something in place, put it in place. So understand, like, that's the role of the board to kind of review those kind of situations. And if some people specifically join the board because they want to change policy and procedure. So in that case, it's their job to work with the building's managing agent, the building's attorney, and if needed, some consultants, depending on what the nature of the issue is. So a good scenario over here, are pets allowed in a building, or specific rules around pets? So I can tell you in my building, the offering plan said no pets. And we're having our first annual meeting, and somebody walks a huge dog through the lobby, and we only have the lobby space to meet in. So I'm like, clearly, like, nobody, it was kind of a free-for-all initially, and then, we said ultimately, as all our owners, that was the one amendment that we've made to our offering plan, and I don't think it was ever properly filed because we didn't know what we were doing at that point. But we've acknowledged that, as okay. In our day-to-day rules, we do allow pets, and we do have a certain definition around it. Should that be more formalized in a formal amendment? Yes, it should. But from a practical matter, in these small buildings, you're often not going to see kind of amendments like that made all the time. So that's something to kind of help set expectations over here. Building structure financing, and obviously this is much more common for co-ops than condos. Generally are not getting loans on the building structure. Usually if you are, it's very short term. It's usually for like 5 years and tends to be quite expensive over there. But co-ops can take a mortgage out on the building structure, and many co-ops take this path to keep the monthly maintenance charges low. So instead of increasing the monthlies, dramatically, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll take out a new mortgage, and the monthlies go up slightly. So that's one way of managing this in co-ops. But this is something that the co-op board is going to wind up thinking about and wind up doing. And the interest portion of that loan is tax deductible for the buildings, so certainly you can make that over there. Condos are typically, like I said, they're typically not taking, mortgage loans out. It's usually going to be like a shorter structure over there. The fees can be quite hefty, so it's not something that you're usually doing. So condos instead usually fund projects in two methods or a hybrid of lending, using reserves and or special assessments. And, building a reserve account, it's typically slowly. It's funded by a portion of the operating budget. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, in this over here. But, in essence, you want to see those common charges, keep up with that and have that 10% minimum reserve for that. The next way to do it is to hold a special assessment. These are less predictable method, for funding large projects, but it is very commonly used. Banks don't like to see it as a general throughout the nation, but it is very common in New York City. But, as long as it's used for capital improvements, and not every project that you might want to take on might be considered a capital improvement. And it's something where you're improving the structure of the building. You're investing in it. So if you're putting a new roof or something of that nature in it, that's considered a capital improvement. So every board addresses these kind of financial needs differently and wind up having, whether you have like a special assessment and how long do you have a special assessment for. A lot of buildings, they want to minimize the risk, so they might have these massive but very short-term special assessments, and that's what we did in our building. Most of them were like 3-4 months in duration, and they were expensive because you're talking like $15,000 to $25,000 special assessments, over just a few months. Now, we did give people leeway that needed it, but we wanted to minimize and not only the risk in the building by having the bulk of the people pay immediately or fairly immediately, but also, so that we could get moving on the repairs quicker. But every building is going to be different. Every building winds up handling it differently, and but because New York City has so many financial professionals, we actually do see a lot of special assessments. Are fairly common, primarily because in doing it that way, as when it's capital improvements, it is actually considered a tax deductible toward your basis, when you go to sell. So that's certainly one of the reasons why, with so many financial professionals in this town over here. So that is certainly one of the reasons why we tend to have a lot of special assessments in town. But a lot of banks don't necessarily like it. They'd prefer that you're doing this either from reserves or that you're doing things, from having a reserve account in your monthlies. So, they're okay. They actually do better with special assessments if it's a combination between reserves and special assessments, but they don't necessarily love pure special assessments.
Of course. Before I let you finish, I just want to give a quick overview of kind of what new board members should be ready to put in action. They need to understand the role of the board and the managing agent. They need to understand the building policy and procedure. They need to understand the building structure and the finances. And then the last one, I think that's going to really, really make you a good board member, is understanding the needs of the building. And I'll just let you just kind of dive into that, because that seems like, from your experience, from when you first started the board, that was the first thing that you decided to do, is understand what was actually wrong and how to come up with solutions. So I'll let you go ahead and dive into that.
All right, so there's a couple ways that you could attack that. So first way is, I tend to say, is understand what owners want, not necessarily what they need, but what they want. So it depends. If your building is in a great financial position, it might be more about wants than needs, and certainly that is a big component of it. And you might want to be reviewing on how boards have taken positions in various ways, and so depending on what's been going on, the board might not want to have tackled certain thing because that it was considered a want and not a need. So they might not have wanted to address it in the past, but maybe going forward you might want to. So in my building we have a massive backyard. It's now been 20 years and we still have really done next to nothing with the backyard. But I'd say we finally got the building into a position where we're finally really in great shape. But then we dive into understand what's on the table going forward in terms of regulations, both ones that we know about and ones that are on the table that are being just discussed as possibilities. Because right now we are working with a city council and a mayor that are very heavy pro-regulation, and an environment where I feel like we've been over-regulated. And just the complexity of New York, we are not anti-regulation in this group over here. We're just anti too much regulation that's just being done because it's popular, not because it's smart. But I do applaud. I did hear that local law 11, they're reevaluating. And that's something that I really wanted to talk about too, is because that tends to be a big expense. So what is local law 11? Local law 11 is, for these buildings that, are at least 6 stories in height. I've heard that it's supposed to be taller than 6 stories, but it all depends on the way that the DOB kind of measures your building. So, for instance, they actually count the cellar in my building, so we're now officially a 7-story building. So I don't quite know exactly all the finite reasons why DOB might consider a building, 6 stories, above 6 stories or not, because obviously, a cellar is kind of questionable, but if that's what they're including, that's what they're including. So these are some of the things, but this annual, every 5-year mandatory inspection of this facade, this tends to be a very, very time-consuming issue for boards. It's also incredibly expensive. Even if your building needs no work, just getting the engineers to review the building facade, that could be a hefty expense. In a building where you have just 12 units, that could easily be anywhere from $15,000 to $30,000 just to get them to review the building, and that assumes that there's nothing wrong. Once they if they find something wrong, it gets really expensive really quickly. But one thing that I've heard for 2030, obviously that's quite a bit further along from now, but there's a proposal to extend out local law 11 from 5 years to 6 years. So it would be every 6 years instead of every 5. That's certainly very helpful to a lot of buildings. My understanding, and I think I've had this conversation on a couple of other episodes, is that, the impression is, in speaking with engineers and architects and contractors, that 6 years versus 5 years, it's not going to make any difference in terms of any kind of safety issues for the overwhelming majority. Now, if there's known issues that weren't addressed previously, then maybe. But the overwhelming majority over there is that. But the reason why I really want to kind of call out, local law 11 was primarily because it is so incredibly expensive, and that winter freeze thaw cycle that we tend to have, temperatures going above and below freezing all the time, that tends to crack the bricks and mortar. So it's entirely possible that you can have some work done, and then there's multiple different statuses once you get the review done. But the positive of local law 11, nobody wants facade elements falling on a pedestrian. So this law, I think, is really important, and it helps minimize this risk of occurring, or worse, if the facade is not properly maintained. The next kind of local law 11, and this is going to be more for those mid-sized buildings over there rather than the smaller buildings, but this law only applies to mid to large-sized buildings, so it might not apply to many of the buildings discussed in this episode. But for buildings over 25,000 square feet with more than 25 apartment, which is still considered small to mid-size category, but this local law 97 applies, and it requires large buildings to meet greenhouse gas emissions caps to reduce the city's carbon footprint. It can be complicated and expensive, and in some instances, and another building, it might only require minimal modifications to be made. So some buildings are going to have to replace their windows, while other buildings might just have to upgrade lighting. Others might have to change over their energy usage, from oil to gas, or from gas into other alternative forms, maybe electric. So it all depends. But there's other routine inspections that tend to happen on a regular basis, and every building should be prepared for it if it applies. So, for instance, elevators, they have an annual and a 5-year inspection. And I want to say that, and I can't verify this for sure. I can go to the managing agent, but offhand, I can't read. I did think there was a 2-year inspection as well, but I could be wrong about that. But yeah, every year at a bare minimum, and each one of those inspections has a different standard. So the 1 year versus the 5 year, and if I'm correct about the 2 year, they each go through different stress tests. So it's not like the same kind of stress test for each one of those inspections. Sprinklers, if your building has sprinklers, which most now do in Manhattan. There's routine sprinkler inspections. I don't know the frequency of that, but again, it's if you're managing a building, if you're on a board, it's important to understand these things. There's a new one that came out recently: gas line inspections. There's now parapet inspection, that one I know is annual, and there's just so much more dependent on your building. So ask your managing agent for a schedule of what's being done, so that and if a schedule is being kept for your building, so that way everyone kind of has a better understanding of what your true costs are and what you need to do to continue to maintain your building properly. A lot of people are not giving all these things a lot of thought. So, when you join a board, now all of a sudden this is your responsibility, because otherwise your building is going to get fines, and then you're going to have to do work, and it just gets ugly. So these are all important, components over here. Physical, there's so many new regulations, it's hard for a managing agent to keep up, let alone self-managed buildings. The managing agents have to keep up with the same laws for many different buildings, so more often than not, they usually know what's going on. It's sometimes something sneaks beyond, but for the most part, the managing agents know, because they're doing this for so many other buildings. Listen to the advice that you're getting from your managing agent, because they are doing this for so many buildings. Yeah. Or at least at a bare minimum, take their experience and roll with that, and understand why they're saying what they're saying. So their advice can be really valuable. And then just some of the most basic things that I recommend for new board members every year: just walk around the building. If you see, here's that New York City adage: if you see something, say something. Same thing applies to, managing your building over here. If you see a crack in the wall, faded paint, it's up to you now to report that to managing agents, so that we can, move forward on getting that fixed. Project management, stay in the loop on the projects and everything that's occurring, and I think that is really important. Get feedback from your neighbors, talk to owners, stay informed, understand what the short and near-term financials are going to be. Those operational expenses, the common charges. Now, we've seen common charges skyrocket in the last few years, and some of that is because of insurance that we know, but some of it's also been just inflation. Yeah. But it's important to kind of stay on top of it, and also communicate what's been going on those things, because everyone just doesn't want to see another bill. Charge, yeah. Another charge just and no explanation. So it's really important to explain when you're going to be raising the common charges and how much. I can tell you in my building, and I feel like it definitely needs review at this point, but from the time that I was on the board and last reviewed we still had a foreclosure on our books that we were still trying to work through. And we had 11 apartments paying for 12. So when we finally got in a 12th apartment that was paying, ultimately now we're getting all this income that we weren't anticipating for so long. So we actually, in my building, we haven't raised the common charges since 2018.
Woo. That's great.
So, like I said, it was kind of like, you guys are going to hate me until you love me. Yeah, you're going to hate me until you love me, and get that stability. Yep. Now, I'm sure we're probably at the end of that line, of freezing common charges for that long. But, but at the same time, it was something that was really important, and it really helped us, get in line. But going forward, it's up to the current board over there to take a look at reserves and figure out what best planning is. Do you have the right team, over here? A lot of times, everyone is volunteers, and you might not have somebody that has the kind of expertise. That's what we're kind of hoping to lean on a managing agent for it, on the attorneys on as much as possible. If we don't have the right team that we fully need, sometimes getting just a body in there just to say yes or no on things is helpful, but that doesn't always give you the right thing. But I think that was most important over here when I was managing my building, was to give the owners a level of address the predictable. And just ultimately everyone wants that sense of common feel and whatnot. Understand what is non-predictable, and having plans for some of these things, just at least financially, knowing that like something is going to break at some point that we didn't anticipate, and just having that financial ability to be able to tackle it. Also understand that there's also always new trends and changes. There's a few good websites out there, that can help guide it. Your managing agent can certainly help keep you in the loop out there. But yeah, these are important things to understand, that these things are happening. But even some of it is even just on the sales front. So for instance, when I bought my place 20 years ago, washer dryers in apartments were very rare. And I had a washer dryer in my apartment. And, and it was like I could brag at that point and say, I got a washer dryer, and it was one of those things that it was so unique. Now it's not so as uncommon. There's plenty of buildings where you still can't have a washer dryer in your building, and that's because the plumbing, the drain stack can't handle the pressure. You need appropriate ventilation in the system. I've learned all this the hard way, by the way.
Yes.
But at the same time, understand that if you're building, it wants to try and keep up with the times, and you say, oh, we want to add washer dryers, that could be a massive project, because you need to make sure that your drain stacks and ventilation systems, are able to accommodate that, because a lot of times, they were not built for the pressure that a washing machine puts out. It just kind of shoots that water out when it's draining. So these are certain things that you want to keep into account. Intercom systems. Now everyone has got all these now internet enabled systems. So it's an expense to add these things on. But certainly understand what the owners want. Are they willing to pay a premium to upgrade? And a lot of times for something like that, they will, especially packages getting stolen and things like that. Across the entire country, everyone wants to control that as much as possible. So these are the things that, as a board member, you're now in charge of, handling these kind of things and setting the tone for it. So find out what's going on. Stay informed, I think, is the most important aspect, of what I can say. But do go beyond what's just minimally required. And as far as co-op specific issues, co-ops can direct policy-driven decisions that might have worked well at one point, but might not have worked as well today or in the future. And I know one of the things that I hear from that is, a lot of people are asking, can I install an HVAC air conditioning system in my apartment? And there's water concerns along with that as well. And a lot of times people ask, can I go through the facade? And that's a big question. A lot of buildings are scared of doing that. And if you do it properly and you work with a managing agent that has gone through this with other buildings, obviously that's something that can be done safely and well. But always ask questions, the board members and the managing agent, about the direction that you want the building to go to. So do we want to loosen some requirements, for buyers to pass our requirements? Do we want to permit pets or pied-à-terres? It's been a tougher market in the last few years, and what we're seeing is there are a lot of co-ops that are kind of loosening the reins a little bit because, otherwise owners are complaining, I can't sell my apartment. Mm-hmm. Our restrictions are too restrictive. So, these are the kinds of things that, that we're asking. Or do we want to refinance the building's mortgage? These are all real questions that a board might be tackling. But I think I want to say over here is, I think this is a good start, for somebody that wanted to join their condo or co-op board that said, I don't know what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And I think we kind of tackled some of the issues and some of the problems that we might encounter, in all this. And I think more or less, you don't necessarily need special skills. You do need to be curious. That really helps.
Yeah.
And just be smart about it, and just take a common sense approach and say, hey, I'm walking around the building, I'm seeing all these problems. Is there any plan to address them?
Yeah.
So sometimes it's really that simple.
Yeah. Well, Adam, thank you so much for really giving us a deeper dive and what it takes to become a board member and what your job or your responsibilities are once you are on the board. And I really appreciate all the knowledge that you gave us today. So
awesome. Great. So, with that, we're going to bid you farewell, but we hope that you enjoyed the Harlem Stories podcast. If you like it, subscribe, hit that like button, and refer your friends and family.
All right. Thank you so much, and talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot.
All right.
Bye.